Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. after a fascinating discussion and report launch on Beyond the Ballot, How the Kremlin Works to Undermine the U.S. Justice System. Suzanne Spalding led the team that wrote this report, and the keynote speaker was the former Secretary of Homeland Security for the United States, Judge Chertoff, Michael Chertoff, Chairman Emeritus of the Chertoff, Executive Chairman of the Chertoff Group. You haven't gotten rid of it yet, and you're also a member of the Transatlantic Commission on Election Integrity, and you and Anders Fogh Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, just wrote a great CNN commentary talking about election integrity on both sides of the Atlantic. Sir, let me start off. You know, how big of a threat is this? You know, when most people think about threats to the United States, they're talking about hypersonic weapons or what happens in space, but in many, many fundamental ways, what Russia is doing to undermine the fabric of American society is actually even graver threat. Talk to us about how every American needs to think about this space and how strategists need to think about it to defend the nation on a fundamental level.
Well, the Russians view information as part of warfare, conflict, and there's a doctrine sometimes referred to as the Gerasimov doctrine after the chief of the general staff, talking about how fighting about information is really a domain of conflict, because if you can manipulate information, you can undermine alliances, you can sap the will to resist, you can create internal division which distracts from fighting a war. Essentially what you're doing is you're weakening your enemy, and it's every bit as significant as somehow entering their military armory and stripping their weapons. So I do think we need to view this as part of a geopolitical contest with rivals and even adversaries who will use it in order to try to undermine our strength.
And how much worse do you think it will get? You know, there are folks who look, for example, at what happened in 2016, and this report does an extraordinary job laying out some of those specific examples. The Lisa example in Germany, for example, the Black Matters group that Russia used, the Internet Research Agency used. How much worse can you get? Because you mentioned a couple of very, very potent examples of how much worse this can become before it improves, actually.
Well, I think, first of all, we need to recognize this is not just about the election, although that's important as well, but even during ordinary daily life, there are times when there are conflicts or there are controversies, and we have seen, as the example a couple of the examples you mentioned, an effort to exploit that controversy by basically ginning up or ramping up agitation on both sides of the issue using phony accounts or impersonating real people. And that can actually lead to physical conflict. So if you do all these things, what you are doing is you are sapping the faith people have in institutions and in each other, and I think this is only going to get worse.
You know, I thought it was funny you used the New Yorker cartoon example where the dog tells the other dog, yeah, but online, nobody knows you're a dog, right? You don't know who's on the other side of it. And you did mention whether it's judicial hacking or even incredibly realistic fake videos that could be released to shape the outcome of elections. Let's talk about how you solve this challenge and how do you address it. How do you act both in a deterrent capacity, and how can Americans, many of whom unfortunately did get duped by this on both sides of the aisle, protect themselves ultimately?
Well, some of this is about education, and then some of it is about the social media platforms and similar types of organizations reducing certain kinds of activities which I don't think impinge upon our freedom of speech. For example, artificial amplification of stories, using automated ways to make it seem as if a story is more popular than it is something which the platforms can take down. When the Russians impersonate an American, that's again something that doesn't deserve free speech protection, and those accounts ought to be shut down. When algorithms are used to intensify people's interest into more and more extreme versions of real stories, again, that is something the social media platforms can correct for. So I think at the level of the platforms, there are things that can be done, and to be honest, are beginning to be done at this point. Individuals, of course, can educate themselves and be mindful of what's going on, and that's part of the reason we're talking about this. And finally, we do need to consider deterring what could be at some point a very serious attack on the actual ability to hold an election, which could couple manipulation of media with actually entering databases, stealing data, shutting down or altering voter registration databases. Some of this is a matter of cybersecurity. Some of it is a matter of deterrence. And we've done a little bit of deterrence already. We've indicted people who hacked. We've levied sanctions against certain people who promoted these kinds of operations. And we may need at some point to consider what other measures are appropriate to forestall or retaliate against a serious attack on our fundamental freedoms.
You mentioned, and there were bipartisan panels here who did discuss the issue, and right, active measures aren't new. In the Soviet era, the Soviet Union was actively trying to undermine. There was an AIDS example from the 1980s that the Russians tried to exploit with mailings, but it was much harder than the internet universe in which we now live. One of the things that you and former Secretary General Rasmussen challenged was Rudy Giuliani, and I think every New Yorker has to say thank you to him and to you for breaking the back of the mafia in the New York area. But, you took him to task on the challenge of, well, we accepted information from the Russians, so what? How do you address this challenge when a major political party with a reputation of being tough on Russia seems to be remarkably comfortable with the notion that their candidate was helped into the Oval Office by this? Like, fundamentally, how do you fight this when half of the political system and potentially half the electorate doesn't think this is an issue?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't attribute that sentiment to most people in the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. One thing we've done with our Transatlantic Commission is formulated a pledge of election integrity that we're encouraging candidates to sign. We've got 150 candidates in the European elections have signed. We were up on Monday, and the three major Canadian parties signed. And what it basically says is this: as a matter of kind of ethics and good government, we're not going to be accepting stolen information, information that we know is fabricated, information from a foreign power, artificially manipulated images that are designed to attack our opponents. And this is simply a matter of every candidate promising the public it's going to be a fair and square fight. And frankly, I can't see a reason a candidate would not want to sign that.
But the President of the United States, with all due respect, has been pushing some of these alternate narratives. I mean, what does that say? What kind of a signal does that potentially send, for example, Russia, that is looking at even more actively, as we've seen from all political and intelligence leaders, that 2020 could be even more sporty?
I think, I have to say, if you look at most of the commentary, you look at Republicans and Democrats in the Congress, you look at the intelligence community, you look at the very comprehensive report that the special counsel put out, I don't think there's anybody who has a serious doubt the Russians attempted to interfere in the election. Now, you can argue about, did it cross the line of legality in terms of what Americans did, but the point is the Russians' intent and effort is demonstrated through the indictments. There are literally chapter and verse being cited about not just online, but physical presence in the U.S. to try to create disturbances and to try to manipulate the system. So I think this is beyond doubt.
And let me ask you one last question. On ethics education, we heard that over, or rather I should say civics education. From a curriculum standpoint, your generation, my generation, had a lot of civics education that we had to go through, whereas now the focus has been much more on science, math, and getting skills up. I don't want to get into the political debate of that, but how important is a grounded civics curriculum that every citizen has to go through? Because some of these issues are more muted, for example, in Finland and Scandinavia, where these programs are much more developed now at this point than they are in the United States.
I think we ought to be teaching everybody things like, first of all, how do you protect yourself on the internet, which many of us do teach. Also, how do you evaluate critically information and understand what is real and what is not real. And I think we've got to teach people the value of our institutions. It's every bit as important as teaching them science and technology to understand why we have the institutions that we do.
Michael Chertoff, a former Secretary of Homeland Security, Executive Chairman of the Chertoff Group, and also on the Transatlantic Commission for Election Integrity. Sir, thanks very much. Look forward to talking to you about this because, there's as we build our national strategies, let me ask you one last question, right? So as we build national strategies, do we need to have some sort of a broader cross-cutting national strategy that addresses this from the civics education piece of this all the way to the warfare piece of it?
I think that's a very good point. I think we do need to look at at all the tools in the toolbox. Some of it's education and inoculating our citizens against being manipulated. Some of it is using deterrence, and some of it is building capabilities in the platforms to root out and shut down impersonation, amplification, and intensification when they are part of a malign campaign by a foreign actor.
Judge Chertoff, thanks very much again.
Thanks a lot.